Hello everyone, the History of Pi channel is with you. Today we're going to talk about New York. The history of modern New York begins with 1613th year. In 1613th year, the ship of a Dutch merchant named Adrian Blon burned down near the modern territory of New York. The crew of the ship was forced to go ashore. The Indians helped the captain and his crew survive the winter, and also assisted in the construction of the ship. The history of New York is just beginning, and already such blunders. I wonder how the crew of the ship, together with the Indians, could build a new ship. After all, a ship of the 17th century is a very complex structure for that time, and it will not be possible to build it without special training. Okay, let's move on. The Dutch liked the new lands, and in 1614th year, they founded a colony near modern Albany. In 1625, new families from Holland arrived in Manhattan, and in the same year, a fort was erected for protection. I don't know exactly how many people have arrived, 100 or 150, but in a year, they built a star fort. I wonder if they brought the bricks for the fort with them. The famous historical event, the purchase of the entire island of Manhattan from the Indians for $24, occurred in 1626th year. This deal was pulled off by Peter Minute, a civil servant and later the first governor of New Holland. In 1628th year, the population of New Holland numbered 270 people. Over the next few decades, new residents arrived in the city. So, for example, in 1639th year, a certain Johannes Bronck arrived. Today, the Bronx district is named in his honor. New Yorkers engaged in trade, as a rule, exchanged various goods from the Indians. The most popular product shipped to Europe is beaver skins. As we can see, the city's population is growing. Historians do not write the exact number of inhabitants during this period, but I think 500 people definitely already lived. Because, if you look at the plan of 1660, we see that the layout of the city has already been made. There is a star bastion, and a huge star wall has been built. I do not know from whom the wall was protected, probably from beavers, because the inhabitants of the city conducted extensive trade with the Indians. In 1664th year, the British captured the city and gave it the modern name New York, in honor of the brother of King George of York. In 1720th year, a shipyard was built in New York, which gave a powerful impetus to the development of the city. In 1790, there were about 33,000 people living in New York. In 1711th year, the first urban planning plan was prepared. It is thanks to this plan that today we have almost flat streets with a perpendicular intersection. Now begins the most interesting part of the history of the city. Let's take a look at the very first photo that was printed in the daily newspaper New York Daily Schedule on the 4th of March 1880. Here we see the slum of New York. There are some shacks on rocky or clay hills. And this is the main city in the USA. The feeling of a catastrophe that has occurred. But here is an old engraving, some piles of stones, potholes, ravines, complete ruin. But the most interesting thing is that there is a gas lamp on the right, and this is a city that is already 200 years old in the official history. Now let's move on to New York's Central Park. I've paid attention to this park before. This is probably the most famous place in New York. I was still thinking what good fellows have preserved a piece of wildlife in a huge city. But it turned out that this park was created artificially. It turns out that this is not an ordinary park, as for example, in Moscow. In Moscow, it's just a free territory where there has never been an urban development, for example, Izmailovsky Park. But on the site of the future New York Park, there used to be urban development. There were houses and people lived there. About 2,000 people lived on the territory of 3 square kilometers. They were all evicted in the middle of the 19th century. From 1858th year to 1873rd year, the construction of the park continued. The territory originally consisted of rocky hills combined with swamps. The soil cover was not suitable for many plants, so it was withdrawn and exported outside the city. 7 million cubic meters of fertile land were brought to its place. Most of the rocks were blown up, which required 250 tons of gunpowder. Look at this picture of 1869th year. Here you can see how people with the help of gunpowder, carts and shovels can level a rocky area of 3 square kilometers. They not only leveled the stone platform, a drainage system was also made in the rocky ground. 270,000 trees were planted. This is what Manhattan looked like at the beginning of the 17th century. And this is our 1660th year. See what the beaver traders can build in 30 years. And the population during this period was less than 1,000 people. So if several hundred people did it all in the middle of the 18th century, then it is not surprising that in the middle of the 19th century, 7 million cubic meters of soil were easily transported for Central Park. Okay, we've sorted out Central Park. Let's look at other photos of the city. After all, not only leveled the area under Central Park, the Americans leveled the whole of Manhattan. Here's a look at these 19th century photographs. They just took it, and with the help of gunpowder, shovels and carts, demolished all the irregularities in the city. I will simply amaze with the scale of the redevelopment. But this is not the most interesting building in New York. Here's a look at this picture. It looks like some kind of ancient Egyptian or Syrian fortress, but it's just a reservoir. This fantastic structure was called the Croton Reservoir. In the middle of the 19th century, a huge water storage tank was built. And they didn't pull it out of the ground because Manhattan. The island is made of stone, and it is difficult to dig. The reservoir was raised above the ground and surrounded by a granite wall 15 meters high and 7 meters thick. You see how simple everything is for a historian. To level the site on a rocky ground with an area of 3 square kilometers under the Central Park. It's easy, but the much smaller water tank had to be lifted. This reservoir very much resembles an ancient fortress. Here's a look at the ancient wall that used to surround Beijing. It seems very similar to me. Maybe, of course, the Beijing wall was also a reservoir before. Here in this photo, he is disassembling the Croton Reservoir. We see that some arched vaults have opened. But most importantly, look at the bottom, there is an entrance, blocked from above by a keystone. If this is a water tank, why did they make a door in it? And this keystone above the door looks very ancient. A very strange structure, this tank. Very similar to the old fortress. But maybe some of the old fortresses were used as a storage for water. I have a video about China City, the link will be in the description. I have already expressed this idea there. But even if the Croton Reservoir is not a fortress, but a real water tank, then I can't believe that it was built in the middle of the 19th century. If historians had found this container in the desert, they would have immediately attributed 2,000 years to it. I do not know what it is, but it is clearly a product of a past civilization. Here's another interesting picture. Look at this huge white rectangle. Is this how the Croton Reservoir was depicted in the 19th century? I think it's some kind of ancient antediluvian structure, but I do not know what it was used for before. And these are just photos of what is in the underground part of New York. It must have been built by Indians. In general, historians have come up with some kind of muddy history of New York. It starts awkwardly, like the Indians helped the Dutch build a ship. According to the official history, the Indians could only build a pirogue and then help in building a ship. Then, in the 17th century, the settlement, which is home to a couple of hundred people, builds star walls and a fort. And all this was built by selling beaver skins. Or take Central Park. How in general was it possible to level the site 3 square kilometers in the rocky ground and transfer 7 million cubic meters of hydrogen earth? And all this in the middle of the 19th century. And probably, all this was transported on a cart. That's it. Watch my channel.